Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling, well, it's quite a stack of material we've got here, a really diverse set of sources.
That's putting it mildly. We're going from, the nitty-gritty of home renovation costs and specific real estate acronyms like BRRR, all the way up to, well, global finance, federal housing history, and some really intense conflicting ideas about power and control.
It's a broad scope, definitely.
Yeah.
But our mission, as always, is to dive deep, synthesize it all, and stay completely impartial. We want to pull out useful insights on building wealth, understanding property value, but also navigating these really complex, wider systems.
And I think the place we absolutely have to start is, interestingly, not with the numbers, but with the psychology behind it all. Because all the strategies in the world don't mean much if you, the listener, can't actually, execute on them.
Right. So let's talk about that core idea from the sources. This choice you have between, well, working for your money versus having your money work for you. That second one, passive income, that's the dream for many, right? But why is it so hard to actually get there?
Well, a lot of it boils down to belief. I mean, the evidence is there. Real estate has historically been a path to wealth for many people. But the sources suggest the biggest hurdle isn't usually finding the right deal. It's internal. It's that self-doubt, that fear.
That really hits home. We can understand intellectually how leverage works, how property values tend to go up over time, but actually taking that plunge, putting down significant capital, especially if you didn't grow up with it, it's intimidating.
It really is. It requires sort of a shift in how you see yourself. Moving from being an employee trading time for dollars to seeing yourself as an owner and investor. And the sources are pretty clear. The biggest breakthroughs often happen just on the other side of that fear. If you can't truly picture financial freedom being possible for you personally, then, well, no amount of strategy helps.
Okay, so overcoming doubt is step one. But then there's just inertia, right? Getting started. Which brings us to habits. Why is it so easy to start something good, exercising, analyzing deals, and then just stop after a few days? It feels like such a chore.
Yeah, the sources suggest we often misunderstand what we're actually craving. It's not the habit itself, but the change in state it brings. Think about bad habits. You crave the feeling of relief from smoking, maybe, or the distraction from scrolling social media. It's an instant reward.
Ah, okay. Whereas good habits, like working out or planning, the reward is delayed. So the initial effort feels like pure friction.
Exactly. You're chasing the feeling, relief, accomplishment, whatever it is, not necessarily the action. So the trick is hacking that initial friction. This is where the idea of a gateway habit and habit stacking comes in.
Right, the formula. After I do my current habit, I will start my new habit, linking it to something you already do automatically.
Yes, but the really clever part, the thing that makes it work, is the 2-minute rule. You have to make the very beginning of that new habit ridiculously easy, almost laughably simple.
So not, I'm going to analyze 5 deals today, but something much smaller.
Much smaller. Like after my morning coffee, I will open my laptop and log into the property listing site. That's it. The goal isn't finishing the task yet. It's just mastering the act of starting. Showing up.
So if I wanted to start yoga, the gateway habit might just be take out my yoga mat.
Or even just put on my workout clothes. Seriously, the minimal possible step. Because once the mat's out or the shoes are on, the inertia starts working for you, not against you. You've overcome that initial hurdle, and you're much more likely to actually do the harder part. It bridges that gap between deciding you want to be an investor and actually, doing the work.
That's a great transition, actually. Starting small, being consistent. Let's apply that to real estate itself. Once you've got the mindset, what's the next step? Defining the goal, right? What are the main investment approaches outlined in the sources?
Broadly speaking, there are 2 main camps: capital gains investing and cash flow investing. Capital gains is pretty straightforward: buy low, hope the property appreciates significantly, then sell high later. It's very dependent on market timing and picking the right location.
And cash flow investing.
Yeah.
That's more about the steady income stream.
Exactly. That's the path to generating consistent, positive monthly income. Your rental income needs to cover all your operating costs, mortgage, taxes, insurance, repairs, and still leave you with profit each month. This is how people tend to build larger, more stable portfolios over time.
And this is where things get tricky, isn't it? Because it's easy to just subtract the mortgage from the rent and think you're golden.
Right.
But the sources hammer this point. You have to account for all expenses, especially CapEx.
Oh, absolutely. Capital expenditures, these are the big, infrequent, but very expensive items. Replacing a roof, a furnace, an air conditioner, maybe all the kitchen appliances. If you haven't been setting money aside for these, they can absolutely wipe out your cash flow, even years of profit.
Can you give us an example? Make it concrete.
Sure. Let's say you buy a place, and after the mortgage, taxes, and insurance, you're clearing $200 a month. Seems okay, right? $2,400 a year. But the roof is kind of old, maybe has 5 years left. Replacing it might cost, say, $15,000. Yeah. If you haven't been saving specifically for that roof, that $15,000 bill suddenly eats up more than 6 years of your supposed profit. That $200 a month wasn't really profit at all. It was just delaying the inevitable expense.
So you need to factor that in from day one. Budgeting for the future? Big stuff.
Precisely. The advice is to set aside a certain amount every month into a separate reserve account just for CapEx. Maybe $250, maybe $400 a month, depends on the property's age and condition. You also have to anticipate property taxes potentially jumping after you buy it, and budget for vacancies, times when you don't have a tenant paying rent.
Okay, let's talk financing. This is a huge advantage in real estate, the ability to use leverage, right? Why is it easier to borrow for property than, say, stocks?
It's because the loan is secured by a physical asset, the property itself. Lenders see this as relatively low risk. If the borrower defaults, the lender can take possession of the property, which usually retains significant value. This security is why ordinary people, not just institutions, can borrow large sums, hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions, at pretty reasonable interest rates. It opens up wealth-building opportunities.
And using that borrowed money, that leverage, boosts your return on the cash you actually invested, your cash-on-cash return.
Dramatically. Let's keep it simple. Buy a $100,000 property, all cash. If it makes $5,000 a year after expenses, that's a 5% cash-on-cash return. Not bad. But what if you only put down $20,000 and borrow the other $80,000? Even after paying the mortgage interest, if you still net a decent profit, your return on that initial $20,000 invested is suddenly much, much higher. Leverage lets your money work harder across more assets.
But there's a big warning here in the sources about predatory lending. Good leverage versus bad debt.
Huge difference. You absolutely have to avoid lenders charging exorbitant rates. We're talking like 16%, 20%, even 24% interest, often with extra fees called points and penalties if you pay it back early. These are sometimes called hard money loans.
Who uses those then?
Maybe a short-term house flipper who plans to be in and out in 60 or 90 days might stomach that for speed. But for a long-term buy-and-hold cash flow investor, those rates are usually unsustainable. It's often a sign of desperation or just really high-risk speculation.
Okay, so speaking of combining leverage and renovation, let's touch on the BRRR strategy.
Right.
Buy, rehab, rent, refinance, repeat. How's that different from just flipping a house?
The key difference is you keep the house after rehabbing it. You rent it out. The goal of the rehab is to force appreciation, increase the property's value significantly. Then you go back to a lender, get it reappraised at the new, higher value, and refinance. Ideally, you pull out most or all of your original investment cash during the refinance.
And then use that cash to buy the next property, the repeat part.
Exactly. But because you're keeping it as a rental, the rehab mindset is different than a flip. You need durable, tough, tenant-proof materials. Think longevity and low maintenance, not just what looks prettiest for a quick sale.
Which leads us perfectly into rehabbing right. The sources say buying right gets you equity, but rehabbing right keeps you from wasting it, spilling the water, as they put it, making improvements that don't actually add value or last.
Yeah, and some upgrades offer more bang for your buck than others. A big one is often adding bedrooms where possible, going from a one-bedroom to a two-bedroom or a two-bed house to a three-bed. That can significantly boost value because it appeals to a wider range of buyers or renters.
But there's a limit, right? Adding a fifth bedroom to a four-bedroom house might not give you the same return, diminishing returns.
Definitely. And you need to focus on practical things too, like electrical. The sources mention GFCI outlets, those safety outlets with the test reset buttons. They cost maybe $20, $30 more than a standard outlet, but are legally required in kitchens and baths now, and they're a huge safety plus. Tiny cost, big value, and risk reduction.
And little things affect costs, too, like whether wires have to be fished through existing walls versus installed in open framing during a bigger gut job.
Right. Same with siding. New siding is a big selling point. Old aluminum siding, the sources warn, might be durable, but it dents easily, the color fades unevenly, and it can be noisy in storms. Replacing old, peeling wood siding is often a better long-term bet than just slapping paint on something that's deteriorating.
Inside, Finishes matter. Countertops, flooring. What's key for countertops, like granite?
The operational detail is crucial. Measure and fabricate after the base cabinets are fully installed. Trying to measure beforehand based on plans often leads to gaps or overhangs being wrong. Seems basic, but it's a common mistake.
And flooring.
Well, things like engineered wood often need pros, but the sources suggest that a good, careful handyman can often install high-quality laminate flooring well, which can save some money compared to more complex materials.
Okay, so that's getting the property rehabbed for value and durability. But when it's time to sell, the focus shifts entirely to presentation staging. It's about selling the space, not the seller's stuff.
Totally. Staging is all about depersonalization, letting potential buyers imagine their life in the home. The sources are really strict on this. Clear everything off, flat surfaces, kitchen counters, mantles, windowsills empty, pack away all personal photos, collections, knickknacks.
Let's create a blank canvas, essentially,
Leave the dreams.
especially in bedrooms.
Yes, very specific guidance there. Use plain, neutral bedding. White linens are often recommended because they maximize the feeling of space and cleanliness and completely remove the current owner's taste or personality.
It sounds like the goal is to make it appealingly average.
Kind of, yeah. The source actually says if the seller doesn't really like how the staged house looks, if it feels too bland to them, that's probably a sign the staging is working. It means you've neutralized it for the broader market.
I was struck by the specifics for targeting Gen Y buyers. Things they do want, like mirrors and certain product displays.
And things they absolutely don't want, like linoleum floors, big, no. Gold-colored fixtures, nope. Needs to be brushed nickel or maybe matte black. And weirdly specific, like no pendant light fixtures. It shows how attuned buyers can be to things that feel dated. Staging is about making calculated choices to hit those current preferences and create that feeling of space and potential.
Okay, let's zoom out now. From the details of one house to the bigger picture, we can't really understand today's market without looking at the history and the policies that shaped it.
Absolutely not. And a huge part of that story, according to the sources, is the role the federal government played in creating and enforcing residential segregation throughout the 20th century. This wasn't just a Southern thing. It was a nationwide federal project using specific laws and practices.
The FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, was key here, wasn't it? Based on a flawed premise.
Completely flawed. They operated under the assumption that if black families moved into white neighborhoods, property values would automatically drop. Based on this racist assumption, they refused to insure mortgages for African Americans in most white neighborhoods, a practice known as redlining.
So this systematically locked black families out of the main path to middle-class wealth in post-war America, suburban home ownership.
For generations, it enforced segregation and dramatically widened the racial wealth gap that persists today. And the irony. The source points out that the FHA's core assumption was often wrong. Because black families were excluded from so many areas when they could buy into a neighborhood, the pent-up demand often meant they had to pay more than fair market value, sometimes causing values to actually increase due to scarcity.
Wow. So the very premise was backward.
Exactly. The source material highlights that median black household wealth today is still just a fraction less than 10% of median white household wealth, and that gap has deep roots in these discriminatory housing policies.
Policy also shaped the ideal home itself, didn't it? Promoting the single-family detached house.
Yes, there was a real push in the 1930s and beyond to equate that specific housing type with good citizenship and the American dream, often at the expense of denser, more urban living arrangements. This government effort helped cement the suburban ideal.
And now we're seeing shifts again with the great inversion, wealthier people moving back to city centers.
Right, which can sometimes lead to the hollowing out of those older inner-ring suburbs. The places between the downtown core and the newer exurbs can face economic stress as demographics shift.
But success in cities can also be destructive. The sources mention how super popular areas like parts of Manhattan can almost choke on their own success. Overbuilding, loss of character, pushing out everyone except the ultra-wealthy.
It's a paradox. Dense, desirable places attract more development, which can eventually destroy the very diversity and livability that made them desirable in the first place. Meanwhile, you still have a massive housing crisis for lower-income people, millions facing eviction annually, and that old rule of thumb spending no more than 30% of income on housing is just impossible for most renters today.
The Stuyvesant Town story in New York is mentioned as a cautionary tale about speculation too, right?
Yeah, a place built for middle-class affordability became a target for massive financial speculation based on future rent hikes. It led to displacement of long-term tenants and even hurt the pension funds that had invested heavily in the deal, hoping for quick profits. It shows how the drive for financial returns can clash with community stability. And that drive leads us straight into the weird world of finance and sometimes market illusions. If we listen to the behavioral finance experts, markets aren't always perfectly efficient. There are barriers, psychological biases that mean prices can get way out of line with rational value. The whole random walk idea gets challenged.
Which sounds like an opportunity for someone to exploit those inefficiencies. And the sources point to mortgage-backed securities as a prime example, initially intended to spread risk.
But later innovations like CDOs, collateralized debt obligations, and credit default swaps were used, according to the sources like The Big Short, for almost the opposite purpose, to hide the risk by making things incredibly complex.
How do they create that illusion of safety with CDOs?
Well, they took thousands of risky subprime mortgages loans to people with poor credit history and bundled them together. The crucial and ultimately disastrous assumption was that these different pools of loans were uncorrelated. They figured, homeowners defaulting in Florida wouldn't necessarily mean homeowners are defaulting in California at the same time.
So they thought bundling diversified the risk away.
Exactly. By slicing and dicing these bundles, they created new securities, the CDOs that rating agencies somehow stamped with AAA ratings, the safest possible grade. It was an illusion built on faulty assumptions about diversification. They essentially repackaged toxic debt and sold it as gold, hiding the underlying risk through sheer complexity.
Okay, so navigating these complex systems, whether it's a housing market or high finance, often involves negotiation. Let's shift to some tactics from the sources for those high-stakes moments. One that surprised me was the power of no.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive, isn't it? We're usually taught to aim for yes. But the source suggests that asking for no actually gives the other person a sense of control and safety. It can open doors.
How does that work?
Well, saying yes can feel like a commitment, sometimes a trap. People say yes just to be polite or end the conversation. But if you ask something like, "Is now a bad time to talk?" and they say no, they've asserted control, they feel safe, and they're often more genuinely open to listening afterwards. No can be the start of a real conversation, not the end.
Interesting. And related to that is focusing on the barriers to a deal, not just the positives.
Right. The reasons someone won't do a deal for their fears, their hesitations are often more powerful than the reasons they will. So the tactic is to identify those potential no's early and address them directly. You label their fear. It seems like you might be concerned about X. Bringing the negatives into the open allows you to diffuse them.
And if you're the buyer in a hot market, you need to sell yourself subtly.
Definitely. You need to constantly, but not obviously, remind the seller why you're a great choice. Are you paying cash? Mention it. Do you have a track record of closing quickly and smoothly? Remind them. The goal is for the seller to think, this buyer is the surest, easiest path to getting this deal done. That can sometimes be more valuable than an extra few $1,000s from a riskier buyer.
Okay, now we have to transition to the final and perhaps most difficult section of our source material. This involves some very strong, conflicting claims about politics, power structures, and health narratives. We absolutely need to stress again, we are reporting impartially on what these specific sources allege. We are not endorsing, verifying, or taking any side on these claims.
That's crucial context because the sources themselves frame political division as something being deliberately exploited.
Yes, one source explicitly claims that the political divide, particularly involving figures like Trump and Republicans, was used strategically to isolate a group the source calls pushbackers. The alleged goal was to pave the way for a subsequent push of what the source labels a full-blown woke cult agenda.
And this source further alleges that this agenda itself fosters division. It traces the roots of these tactics back to Saul Alinsky, describing him in specific terms as an ultra-Zionist, whose ideas supposedly underpin this modern agenda. Again, this is solely the terminology and claim presented in the source.
These allegations of control extend into the realm of global health in the source material. It's claimed that the narrative around COVID was forced upon medical staff through fear, although the source also mentions widespread ignorance as a factor in compliance. This compliance, it's alleged, stems from policies linked to figures that the source identifies with the cult.
And within that, there's a very specific, highly controversial claim reported by the source. It alleges that communication between a citizen journalist and the UK's MHRA, which the source notes is Gates-funded, supposedly revealed that the vaccine wasn't based on an actual isolated virus, but on a computer-generated model. We have to be extremely clear. We are relaying this claim exactly as it appears in the source provided, without independent verification or endorsement.
To provide a psychological framework for these claims, the source introduces a concept called Wetiko. It's described as a sort of virus of consciousness that supposedly manifests through key figures associated with the COVID response. Names like Gates, Schwab, Fauci are mentioned portraying them as expressions of this controlling force. The idea presented is that people either fall under its influence or resist through awareness.
It's worth remembering historically how difficult uncovering complex narratives or potential cover-ups can be. Take Watergate, for example. The initial plan, according to the sources on that, was straightforward. Gordon Liddy would take the blame for the break-in, and the whole thing would hopefully just go away.
And the official response was complete denial. The White House issued strong, flat-out denials of the Washington Post reporting and refused access to key figures like Haldeman and Colson.
Absolutely. It shows how entrenched power structures can deploy stonewalling and complete refutation. It forced the reporters back to basics, digging for corroboration, source by source. Getting to the truth in the face of that kind of resistance requires incredible persistence and effort.
So after diving through all of this personal habits, real estate mechanics, historical policy, market manipulation, negotiation, and these intense conflicting narratives, what's the big takeaway for you, the listener?
Well, we started with the micro, that 2-minute rule for habits, and ended with the macro, huge systemic forces and contested information. But maybe the connecting thread is the absolute need for rigorous, personal due diligence and critical thinking across the board.
Whether you're checking the math on CapEx reserves for a rental property or trying to make sense of complex financial instruments or news reports, transparency seems key.
Exactly. We talked about how basic asset management demands transparency, knowing the NAV, the GAV, the leverage rules for things like REITs. That's a world away from the deliberate opacity designed into things like those complex CDOs that hid risk.
And that need for clarity, for understanding what's really going on beneath the surface, it extends way beyond just finance, doesn't it? Into the information we consume, the narratives we accept.
Which leads us to our final thought. If, as behavioral finance suggests, market prices can often be disconnected from fundamental value due to psychological biases and market inefficiencies, meaning the price tag isn't always real.
And if, at the same time, some sources are alleging that major narratives about governance, health, and science might be deliberately constructed, computer-generated, or part of hidden agendas.
Then the provocative question is, how much deep personal investigation and critical analysis must you undertake before you commit either your capital to an investment or your conviction to a particular viewpoint or narrative? The challenge, perhaps the core challenge highlighted today, is figuring out what and who you can truly trust when both prices and facts might be subject to manipulation or distortion by forces you can't easily see. Something to really think about.